absolute monarch, and the 20-year-old American hustler who mastered him behind closed doors. King Charles I of Württemberg drained his national treasury for a forbidden male lover. This is the ruthless extortion and the gay affair the German Empire tried to bury. To be a gay monarch in 19th century Germany was to rule with a target on your back. The entire empire was a hypermasculine war machine, forged in the cold iron of Chancellor Otto von Bismarck. Power meant aggressive, traditional masculinity. A king had to be a ruthless commander and a fertile patriarch. Deviation was a direct threat to the state. Under paragraph 175 of the Imperial Penal Code, same-sex relations were a felony. For a royal, the stakes were apocalyptic. Exposure didn't just mean prison. It meant total erasure, forced abdication, or being declared legally insane and locked in an asylum, a fate that had just destroyed King Ludwig II of Bavaria. King Charles inherited this brutal machine in 1864. To the public, he projected sovereign perfection, married to Grand Duchess Olga of Russia to cement a geopolitical alliance. In reality, the marriage was a sexless, hollow theater. They lived entirely separate lives in the freezing corridors of the Stuttgart Palace. Beneath the heavy military uniforms, Charles was a closeted gay man. He was an artist at heart, a patron of ballet and architecture, suffocating in a court that demanded a warlord and despised his true nature. By his 60th year, the king wasn't just tired. He was emotionally starved, totally isolated, and dangerously vulnerable. He was the perfect mark. It was within this fragile psychological state that Charles encountered his ruin. In 1883, while seeking respite from the heavy atmosphere of his court, the aging king met a young man named Charles Woodcock. The contrast between the two could not have been more extreme. Woodcock was an American, a mere 20 years old, of modest background, and working in Europe as a professional reader, a paid companion whose job was to read literature aloud to wealthy patrons. He possessed a sharp, youthful beauty, a captivating charm, and an underlying ruthless ambition. For King Charles, the meeting was a revelation. This violent collision of suppressed desire and sudden liberation shattered the king's decades of restraint. The king fell deeply, unconditionally, and blindly in love. Woodcock offered him the illusion of genuine affection and the intoxicating vitality of youth, things the crown had never been able to purchase. But while Charles saw a soulmate, Woodcock saw an unprecedented opportunity. What followed was one of the most reckless and public displays of same-sex affection in European royal history. Blinded by passion, Charles abandoned the caution that had defined his entire life. Shattering royal protocol, he dragged the young American directly into the blinding light of the Württemberg court. The king and his reader became inseparable, traveling together, dining together, and, in a move that shocked the conservative aristocracy, frequently appearing in public wearing identical tailored matching outfits. This sartorial declaration of unity was an unheard of provocation. But Charles went further. He elevated his lover from a working-class American immigrant to the European nobility, bestowing upon Woodcock the title of Baron von Savage. He granted him luxurious quarters within the royal palace, showered him with extravagant gifts, and allowed him to wield an alarming degree of influence over the daily operations of the royal household. The court of Württemberg watched in a state of mounting horror. Prime Minister Hermann Mitternacht, the conservative nobility, and Queen Olga were appalled. The court watched a parasite bleed their monarchy dry, viewing his presence as a grave threat to national security. The spectacle of a foreign youth dictating terms to the king and flaunting his unearned wealth enraged the establishment. Whispers of the unnatural relationship seeped out of the palace walls, crossing borders and catching the attention of both the American and European press. Satirical cartoons and thinly veiled articles began to circulate, threatening to expose the true nature of the king's affection. In Berlin, Chancellor Bismarck observed the situation with cold, calculating disapproval. The pressure on King Charles to sever ties with the American was immense, culminating in direct ultimatums from his own government. For years, Charles resisted clinging to the young man who had brought light into his twilight years. During this period of intense devotion, the king poured his heart out onto paper. He wrote hundreds of passionate, homoerotic letters to Woodcock. These desperate, vulnerable outpourings laid bare the dangerous obsession of a monarch, replacing measured statecraft with raw, homoerotic longing. In them, Charles called Woodcock his most precious friend and a noble soul, detailing his profound emotional dependency and intimate physical desires. He handed his lover the very weapon that would eventually be used to destroy him. By 1888, the political pressure had become insurmountable. The government of Württemberg, fearing intervention from the German Empire and a total collapse of royal authority, forced the king's hand. Woodcock was to be expelled from the kingdom. It was at this precise moment that the young American dropped his mask of devotion. Realizing his time as the uncrowned prince of Stuttgart was over, Woodcock initiated a calculated and devastating scheme of extortion. He packed his bags, but he did not leave empty-handed. He took with him the archive of over 300 explicit love letters written by the king. Woodcock presented a chilling ultimatum to the Württemberg court. Unless he was paid an astronomical sum of money, he would release the entire collection of letters to the international press. He knew exactly what he was doing. He was weaponizing the rampant homophobia of the 19th century against the very man who had loved him. The threat struck at the core of the king's deepest terrors. If the letters were published, Charles would be exposed not just as a homosexual, but as a monarch who had compromised the integrity of his state for a lover. He would face public humiliation, forced abdication, and the very real threat of being committed to an asylum. The ensuing crisis paralyzed the government. The Prime Minister and the Queen, who harbored a deep hatred for Woodcock, found themselves in the agonizing position of having to protect the man they despised in order to save the kingdom. They could not use the military or police to silence the American without risking the very exposure they were trying to prevent. The blackmailer held all the cards. In a deeply humiliating capitulation, the royal treasury was forced to secretly authorize a massive payout. It was hush money on a sovereign scale, the price of a kingdom's dignity. Woodcock surrendered the letters, took his illicit fortune, and sailed back to the United States, leaving behind a shattered man and a permanently stained monarchy. The aftermath of the blackmail was a slow, agonizing death of the spirit for King Charles I. He had not only lost the great love of his life, he had been forced to witness the terrifying reality that this love was entirely transactional. He had willingly handed the keys of his kingdom to an opportunistic predator. Stripped of his dignity, he became a ghost haunting his own palace. The people of Württemberg, aware of the rumors, if not the exact financial details of the blackmail, lost all respect for him, quietly referring to him as the senile, degenerate king. He spent the last years of his life from 1889 to 1891 in total isolation, stripped of any real political power enduring the silent contempt of his wife and his ministers. It passed away on October 6, 1891, a broken, solitary figure, crushed entirely by the weight of a hostile world and his own fragile heart. Charles Woodcock, the architect of this royal disaster, returned to New York, changed his name, and lived out his days in wealth and comfort, a testament to the brutal truth that in the collision between forbidden love and ruthless ambition, the cynic often emerges victorious. The tragedy of King Charles I remains one of the most poignant and devastating examples of the LGBT experience in European history. It highlights the agonizing contradiction of a man who possessed absolute worldly power, yet was utterly powerless to live his truth without being exploited, extorted, and ultimately destroyed. His story is a dark mirror reflecting the hypocrisy of an era that forced individuals into corners so desperate that love itself became a fatal vulnerability. Yet, this dynamic of power, forbidden desire, and blackmail was not an isolated incident in the strict militaristic world of the German Empire. While Charles I faded into humiliated obscurity, the stage was already being set in Berlin for another, even more explosive scandal, a crisis that would entangle the highest echelons of the military, a circle of aristocratic confidants, and an arrogant emperor whose own whispered inclinations would threaten to tear down the entire political structure of Europe on the eve of global conflict. Imagine a man dragged before the glaring lights of the world's press, branded a degenerate, a national security threat, and a traitor responsible for the moral decay of an entire empire. The public spat upon his name, and the courts meticulously stripped him of his dignity, transforming him into a grotesque caricature of corruption. Yet merely a season prior, this exact same man was the undisputed architect of German foreign policy, a prince who hosted the emperor at his lavish hunting estate, a diplomat who wore the gleaming star of the Order of the Black Eagle, and the singular, irreplaceable confidant to the most powerful monarch in Europe. This was Philip, Prince of Eulenburg. How did the most brilliant shadow diplomat of his generation allow his private, intimate affections to become the precise weapon that destroyed his life, severed his 30-year bond with the emperor, and irrevocably fractured the foundation of the German Empire on the precipice of war? While King Charles of Württemberg was bleeding his treasury dry to pay off an American extortionist in the quiet, humiliating shadows of Stuttgart, a far more sophisticated and devastating tragedy was brewing in the nerve center of the German Empire. In Berlin, the stakes were not merely a king's personal dignity, but the geopolitical trajectory of Europe. The Victorian morality that had trapped Charles was equally weaponized in the Prussian capital, but here it was wielded not by opportunistic lovers seeking a payout, but by ruthless political operatives seeking absolute dominance. Paragraph 175 of the Penal Code, which criminalized homosexuality, was the ultimate political guillotine. It was a blade kept permanently sharp, waiting for the moment when a political rival needed to be not merely defeated, but entirely erased from history. At the center of this impending catastrophe was Kaiser Wilhelm II. The emperor was a man defined by a crippling insecurity masked by an obsession with hyper-masculinity. He was the supreme warlord, demanding a court characterized by rigid military discipline, aggressive posturing, and the endless rattling of sabers. Yet Wilhelm possessed a fractured psyche. The relentless, suffocating atmosphere of Prussian militarism exhausted him. He secretly craved artistic stimulation, emotional warmth, and a sanctuary where he did not have to play the role of the infallible iron autocrat. He found this sanctuary in the Liebenberg Circle, an exclusive, highly cultured group of aristocrats centered around his closest friend, Prince Philip of Eulenburg. Eulenburg was everything the traditional Prussian generals were not. He was a diplomat, a musician, a poet, and a man of profound aesthetic refinement. He was soft-spoken, spiritually inclined, and possessed a charismatic charm that entirely captivated the Kaiser. For nearly 3 decades, Eulenburg's country estate, Liebenberg, served as the emperor's spiritual retreat. Here, the military uniforms were discarded in favor of civilian clothes. The men engaged in poetry readings, musical performances, and deep, emotionally intimate conversations. They referred to each other using affectionate nicknames, wrote deeply romantic homoerotic letters, and operated within a culture of exclusive, intense male friendship. Eulenburg became the bosom friend, the only man permitted to speak frankly to the emperor, effectively acting as an invisible barrier between Wilhelm and the hawkish military elite who aggressively pushed for war and imperial expansion. The military and political establishment, spearheaded by men like the ruthless Foreign Office architect Friedrich von Holstein and Admiral Alfred von Tirpitz, viewed the Liebenberg Circle with a mixture of intense jealousy and visceral disgust. They despised Eulenburg's pacifist influence over the Kaiser. They recognized that as long as the emperor was emotionally dependent on this circle of artistic, soft-spoken aristocrats, the aggressive, expansionist goals of the German military machine would be continually thwarted. The generals did not just see a political disagreement. They saw a fundamental weakness, a feminization of the sovereign that threatened the very survival of the state. They needed to destroy Eulenburg, but his diplomatic record was flawless, and his bond with the emperor seemed unbreakable. They needed a weapon that bypassed political debate and struck directly at the moral core of the empire. They found it in the whispered rumors of Eulenburg's sexuality. The catalyst for destruction arrived during the First Moroccan Crisis of 1905. The German military establishment pushed the Kaiser toward a direct, aggressive confrontation with France, a move that could have easily sparked a European war. Eulenburg, utilizing his unparalleled access, quietly advised the Kaiser to step back from the brink, advocating for a peaceful diplomatic resolution. Wilhelm listened to his friend, and the crisis was averted. The hawkish faction was furious. Friedrich von Holstein, who had lost his position largely due to the peaceful resolution of the crisis, decided it was time to deploy the nuclear option. Holstein, a master of dark arts and political espionage, had spent years collecting a dossier on the private lives of the Liebenberg Circle. He knew about the homoerotic letters, the late-night rendezvous, and the undeniable same-sex inclinations of Eulenburg and his closest associate, Count Kuno von Moltke, the military commandant of Berlin. Holstein did not strike directly. He handed his explosive intelligence to Maximilian Harden, one of the most feared and brilliant publicists in Germany. Harden was a ruthless journalist who despised Wilhelm II and believed the empire was rotting from the inside out. He did not care about the money that motivated men like Charles Woodcock. Harden wanted to engineer a political earthquake. In the pages of his widely read magazine, Zukunft, Harden launched a systematic, devastating campaign of outing. He did not merely accuse Eulenburg and Moltke of violating paragraph 175. He framed their homosexuality as a treasonous political conspiracy. He coined the term camarilla, painting a picture of a sinister, effeminate cabal of homosexuals who were poisoning the emperor's mind, weakening the military resolve of the nation, and acting as agents of foreign powers due to their soft nature. The public reaction was instantaneous and apocalyptic. The German public, deeply conditioned by homophobia and militaristic pride, was whipped into a frenzy of moral panic. The idea that their supreme warlord was being manipulated by a ring of homosexuals was an intolerable humiliation. The blackmail here was not a demand for cash, it was a demand for total political annihilation. Hardin essentially held a gun to the emperor's head. Purge your closest friends, or I will imply that you, the Kaiser, are also a participant in their degenerate activities. Faced with the terrifying prospect of being implicated in a homosexuality scandal, a scenario that would have undoubtedly triggered a constitutional crisis and potentially cost him his throne, Wilhelm II reacted with the cold, self-preserving cruelty that defines absolute power. He did not defend the man who had been his loyal confidant, his spiritual guide, and his closest friend for 30 years. Terrified of the public mob and the judgment of his generals, the Kaiser immediately and permanently severed all ties with Eulenburg and the entire Liebenberg circle. He ordered Moltke to resign his post and demanded that Eulenburg clear his name in open court, fully aware that the judicial system of the era was a slaughterhouse for anyone accused of same-sex deviance. What followed between 1907 and 1909 was the Hardin-Eulenburg affair, the largest and most destructive public scandal in the history of the German Empire. It was a series of grueling, highly publicized libel and perjury trials that dragged the private lives of the aristocracy into the gutter. Moltke and Eulenburg were forced to endure hours of humiliating cross-examination regarding their most intimate bodily functions, their friendships, and their private correspondence. Former lovers were bribed, blackmailed, and paraded through the courtroom to testify against them. Letters detailing profound emotional longing were read aloud to mocking journalists and a disgusted public. The prosecution aggressively weaponized the men's artistic sensibilities, arguing that their love for poetry and music was scientific proof of a deviant feminine neurological structure. Eulenburg, an aging man of delicate health, collapsed under the relentless psychological and physical pressure of the trials. He suffered a severe nervous breakdown and a heart attack. He was carried into the courtroom on a stretcher, a broken, dying man, to face the relentless barrage of questions about his sexuality. The prince, who had once orchestrated the alliances of empires, was reduced to a shivering spectacle, forced to listen as his life's work was entirely eclipsed by the state's obsession with his bedroom. He was ultimately charged with perjury for denying his homosexual acts, though his declining health indefinitely postponed the final verdict. The political extortion was a complete devastating success. The Liebenberg circle was annihilated. Moltke was ruined. Eulenburg was banished to his estate, a social pariah, stripped of his honors, his friendships, and his legacy, left to rot in isolation until his death years later. The Kaiser, having sacrificed his friends to save his own skin, was left isolated, surrounded only by the rigid, aggressive military commanders who had orchestrated the purge. The voices of peace, diplomacy, and artistic nuance were entirely excised from the highest levels of the German government. The destruction of Philippe, Prince of Eulenburg, proved that in the ruthless machinery of statecraft, sexuality was not a private matter, it was the ultimate vulnerability. It demonstrated that even the highest echelons of power offered no protection against the weaponization of homophobia. The tragedy of the affair was not merely the personal ruin of brilliant men. By purging the government of its diplomatic, pacifying influences under the guise of eradicating homosexual weakness, the German Empire committed itself to the aggressive, hyper-masculine militarism that would, just a few short years later, plunge the entire continent into the catastrophic slaughter of the First World War. The true victims of this blackmail were not just Eulenburg and Moltke. It was an entire generation marching toward the trenches, led by men who had mistaken brutality for strength and empathy for treason. The British Empire did not execute its outcasts with the militaristic theater of a Prussian purge. It smothered them under the suffocating velvet of bureaucratic cover-ups and forced exile, while the German Empire relied on the brutal public destruction of men like Prince Philip of Eulenburg to enforce its hyper-masculine delusions. The Victorian establishment across the English Channel perfected the art of the silent vanishing. London, in the late 19th century, was the undisputed capital of the world, a metropolis of staggering wealth and crushing poverty, operating under a moral code so uncompromisingly rigid that it generated a massive subterranean economy of illicit desire. The Victorian social contract demanded an absolute facade of Christian propriety, family values, and aggressive imperial masculinity. Beneath this veneer, however, the aristocracy navigated a dangerous landscape where their wealth could purchase any experience, but their status made them the ultimate targets for ruin. The tension between public morality and private reality was a coiled spring, and in the summer of 1889, that spring snapped violently inside a nondescript terraced house at number 19 Cleveland Street. This was not a scandal born in the glittering halls of a palace or the diplomatic salons of Berlin. It erupted from the grimy, gas-lit underbelly of the working class. Cleveland Street was a male brothel operated by a man named Charles Hammond. His primary employees were not professional escorts, but teenage telegraph boys employed by the General Post Office. These boys, aged 15 to 19, walked the streets of London delivering the nervous system of the empire's communications for a meager 14 shillings a week. Hammond offered them a way to multiply their income exponentially. For a few extra shillings, they were introduced to a clientele composed of the highest echelons of the British aristocracy, military officers, and members of Parliament. The explosive nature of Cleveland Street lay in this exact intersection of extreme privilege and extreme vulnerability. The clients possessed titles, fortunes, and the power to shape global policy. The boys possessed nothing but their youth, their poverty, and most lethally the identities of the men who paid them. The mechanism of destruction was set in motion not by a calculated political rival, but by the mundane machinery of a routine police investigation. In July 1889, a police constable investigating a petty theft of 14 shillings discovered the money on a 15-year-old telegraph boy named Charles Thomas Swinskow. Under the terrifying pressure of an interrogation at the local police station, Swinskow broke. He confessed that the money was not stolen, but earned through extra work at number 19 Cleveland Street. He named the proprietor, he named the procurers, and devastatingly, he began to name the clients, the police constables, expecting to wrap up a minor case of juvenile delinquency, suddenly found themselves holding a live explosive that threatened to detonate directly under the House of Lords. As the police widened their net, interrogating more boys and gathering witness statements, one name emerged with terrifying frequency: Lord Arthur Somerset. known affectionately as Podge to his peers. Somerset was not a fringe aristocrat. He was the superintendent of the stables to the Prince of Wales, a highly decorated major in the Royal Horse Guards, and an intimate member of the royal household. He was the physical embodiment of the dashing aristocratic military ideal. To the public, he was a pillar of the establishment. To the boys at Cleveland Street, he was a regular client. When the police reports detailing Somerset's involvement moved up the chain of command, landing on the desk of the Director of Public Prosecutions and eventually reaching Prime Minister Lord Salisbury, the machinery of British justice ground to a panicked halt. The government faced a crisis of catastrophic proportions. If they proceeded with a standard prosecution, Lord Arthur Somerset would be arrested, put on trial, and forced to defend himself in a public courtroom against the testimonies of working-class teenagers. The press, already hostile to the privileges of the aristocracy, would devour the story, but the true terror running through the veins of the British establishment was not merely the ruin of Lord Somerset. It was the terrifying concept of mutually assured destruction. The brothel keepers and the teenage boys understood the currency of blackmail. It did not require a formal demand for cash. The threat was implicit in their very existence. If the state sought to crush them, they would leverage their only asset. They would name every lord, every general, and every royal associate they had ever seen in the dim light of Cleveland Street. This implicit blackmail paralyzed the government. The situation escalated from a policing matter to a high-stakes operation of state security because the rumors extending from Cleveland Street began to touch the most sacred, untouchable institution of all, the crown itself. Whispers began to circulate through the elite clubs of London that Lord Arthur Somerset was not the highest-ranking client. The rumors alleged that Prince Albert Victor, known as Prince Eddie, the eldest son of the Prince of Wales and the heir presumptive to the British throne, had also visited the brothel. Whether the prince was actually involved or simply the victim of guilty association through his close friendship with Somerset was irrelevant to the political calculus of the moment. The mere existence of the rumor was a fatal threat. If the heir to the empire was publicly accused of participating in a homosexual brothel with adolescent telegraph boys, the resulting moral revulsion could shatter the monarchy, embolden Republican movements, and trigger a constitutional collapse. The state was forced into a brutal triage. The preservation of the institution completely superseded the execution of the law. Prime Minister Lord Salisbury orchestrated a masterful, cynical campaign of deliberate delay and containment. Rather than arresting Lord Arthur Somerset immediately, the authorities stalled. They allowed the police investigation to be bogged down in bureaucratic reviews. The goal was not to build a watertight case, but to provide Somerset with enough time to understand his predicament and flee the jurisdiction. The aristocracy rallied to protect its own, not out of empathy for Somerset's sexuality, but out of a desperate need to seal the breach in their social armor. The Prince of Wales himself, horrified by the implications for his son and his household, exerted immense pressure to ensure the matter was handled quietly. Somerset realized the trap was closing. The psychological weight of that realization is difficult to overstate. He was a man who had dedicated his entire life to the rigid protocols of the cavalry, the royal court, and the upper-class social season. In a matter of days, his entire reality disintegrated. He was informed through the quiet, deniable channels of the elite that an arrest warrant was inevitable. He faced the choice between standing trial, which would guarantee a sentence of hard labor, the total humiliation of his family, and the forced exposure of his royal connections, or permanent, silent exile. Stripped of his military commission, his royal appointments, and his reputation, Somerset boarded a train for the continent. He left behind everything that defined his existence, trading his life in the center of the empire for the agonizing existence of a fugitive. While the aristocrat was permitted to slip through the fingers of justice, the state unleashed its full punitive fury upon the working-class participants. The teenage telegraph boys were subjected to grueling interrogations and jail sentences. Charles Hammond, the brothel keeper, managed to escape to France and eventually the United States, utilizing the very extortionate leverage the government feared to secure his passage. The hypocrisy of the Victorian justice system was laid bare. The law was applied with crushing severity to the impoverished youths who had been commodified by the wealthy, while the wealthy architects of the exploitation were granted the privilege of a quiet disappearance. The cover-up, however, was not entirely seamless. Ernest Parkey, a crusading and reckless journalist for the North London press, caught wind of the aristocratic exodus. Disgusted by the glaring double standard, Park published an explosive article hinting at the cover-up and eventually naming another aristocrat, the Earl of Euston, as a client. The state's response was swift and merciless. Euston sued for criminal libel. Despite compelling evidence that Euston had indeed visited the address, the court system closed ranks. The judge directed the jury with overwhelming bias. The defense's witnesses were discredited as degenerate liars, and Park was found guilty. The journalist who attempted to expose the blackmail and hypocrisy of the establishment was sentenced to a year in prison. The message was unmistakable. The state would actively destroy anyone who threatened to illuminate the darkest corners of aristocratic privilege. Lord Arthur Somerset lived the remainder of his life as a ghost haunting the edges of Europe. He settled in the south of France, living under an assumed name entirely severed from the world he had once commanded. The trauma of his exile was absolute. He wrote desperate, pathetic letters to his family and former friends, begging for news of London, pleading for permission to return, and trying to comprehend how a life of dedicated service had been erased overnight by the very society he had served. He was a victim of his own desires, certainly, but he was also the victim of a system that criminalized his nature and then weaponized that criminality to protect its own power structures. He died in Yare in 1926, an old, broken man, largely forgotten by the nation that had forced him into the shadows. The Cleveland Street scandal demonstrated that the blackmail operating at the highest levels of society was rarely as simple as an exchange of cash for letters. It was a structural, systemic extortion. The rigid morality of the era created the vulnerability, the disparity of class created the leverage, and the terrifying fragility of public reputation forced the state into acts of extreme corruption to maintain the illusion of order. The men who ruled the world were ultimately held hostage by the exact moral laws they themselves championed. Whether it was King Charles in Stuttgart, Prince Eulenburg in Berlin, or Lord Somerset in London, the architecture of their ruin was identical. They were crushed not merely by the people who threatened to expose them, but by the overwhelming, unforgiving weight of a society that demanded an impossible perfection, punishing the reality of human intimacy with total annihilation. The illusion of safety for 19th century royal relied entirely on the architecture of secrecy. King Charles of Württemberg believed his vast treasury could purchase a permanent veil over his desires. Lord Arthur Somerset believed the English Channel was wide enough to wash away his crimes. Philip, Prince of Eulenburg, believed his decades of unparalleled diplomatic service would shield him from the political guillotine. They were all systematically proven wrong. But there was another method of survival attempted within the claustrophobic corridors of European power, one far more dangerous than bribery, flight, or political maneuvering. It was the strategy of arrogant, absolute defiance. If blackmail feeds on the fear of exposure, what happens when a royal prince simply refuses to hide? The answer was articulated not in the quiet, desperate exchange of funds, but in the sharp, echoing crack of a public physical assault within the steamy confines of a Viennese bathhouse. To comprehend the sheer gravitational force of this collision, one must look at the Austro-Hungarian Empire at the dawn of the 20th century. The empire was a sprawling, archaic mosaic of nationalities, held together by the rigid, unyielding glue of the Habsburg dynasty and the Catholic Church. At its center was Emperor Franz Joseph, a monarch who ruled for nearly 68 years, functioning less as a human being and more as the ultimate bureaucratic engine of the state. He slept on a simple iron cot, rose before dawn, and dedicated every waking second to the preservation of imperial duty. The Hofburg Palace in Vienna operated under the strict, suffocating protocols of the Spanish court ceremonial, an etiquette so severe it dictated the exact distance a person must stand from the monarch based on their lineage. In this environment, personal desire was not merely suppressed, it was entirely irrelevant to the machinery of the empire. Yet standing in jarring, almost blinding contrast to the ascetic emperor was his youngest brother, Archduke Ludwig Victor. Known derisively within the inner circles of the aristocracy as Luziwuzi, Ludwig Victor was everything Franz Joseph was not. He was sharply intelligent, fiercely aesthetic, openly cynical, and possessed a venomous tongue that made him the most feared gossip in Vienna. He categorically refused to fulfill his dynastic duty. He rejected multiple arranged marriages, including a highly strategic match with Duchess Sophie Charlotte in Bavaria, the sister of the Empress Elizabeth. But his refusal to marry was only the surface of his rebellion. Ludwig Victor was a homosexual who possessed neither the cautious terror of King Charles of Württemberg nor the refined philosophical justifications of Prince Eulenburg. He operated with the blinding arrogance of a man who believed his royal blood granted him absolute immunity from the moral laws of mortals. While other aristocratic men of his era navigated the treacherous waters of same-sex attraction through coded language, clandestine meetings, and the agonizing fear of extortion, Ludwig Victor treated his sexuality as an open secret protected by the shadow of the imperial throne. He curated a circle of handsome young officers and artists. He was known to attend highly exclusive, private aristocratic gatherings, dressed in elaborate women's clothing. He wielded his royal status like a bludgeon, assuming that no police officer would dare arrest him, no journalist would dare write about him, and no commoner would dare defy him. He did not fear blackmail because he believed the state itself was his personal bodyguard. He fundamentally misunderstood the nature of the society he was provoking. The Habsburg establishment tolerated his eccentricities only as long as they remained behind the velvet ropes of the palaces. The geography of Vienna, however, offered a dangerous intersection between the untouchable elite and the desperate commoner. Beneath the glittering facade of the Ringstrasse lay the subterranean world of the public bathhouses, The most famous of these was the Central Bad. It was an architectural marvel of Moorish design, a labyrinth of tiled pools, steam rooms, and private cabins. Within the dense, obscuring fog of the Central Bad, the rigid hierarchies of the Austro-Hungarian Empire temporarily dissolved. A naked archduke was virtually indistinguishable from a naked cavalry lieutenant or a working-class clerk. It was an environment that bred a terrifying equality, and in that equality lay the seeds of profound vulnerability. It was the hunting ground for the wealthy, but it was also the perfect trap for the extortionist. In 1904, the Archduke's strategy of arrogant defiance shattered in spectacular fashion. Ludwig Victor, operating with his usual aggressive entitlement, frequented the Central Bad. According to the suppressed reports that eventually leaked through the porous walls of the Viennese elite, the Archduke made an unwanted, highly aggressive sexual advance toward a young man in the public pool. The target of his affection was not an intimidated telegraph boy like those in London, nor a calculated fortune hunter like Charles Woodcock. It was a young, fiercely proud military officer who either did not recognize the Archduke in the steam or recognized him and simply did not care. The collision of imperial arrogance and common dignity was instantaneous and violent. The young officer did not lower his eyes. He did not retreat. Instead, he struck Archduke Ludwig Victor violently across the face. The sound of that slap was the death knell of the Archduke's public life. A physical brawl erupted in the water. The emperor's brother, a man who possessed the bloodline of the Holy Roman emperors, was publicly beaten and humiliated by a commoner in a municipal bathhouse filled with witnesses. The incident could not be contained. The illusion of royal invulnerability evaporated the moment the Archduke's blood hit the tiled floor. The police were called, identities were revealed, and the terrifying machinery of public scandal began to grind into motion. Unlike the government of Württemberg, which panicked and emptied its treasury to buy silence from an American blackmailer, the Habsburg court did not negotiate. Emperor Franz Joseph possessed a singular, ruthless priority: the absolute preservation of the dynasty's dignity. He did not view his brother as a victim of a changing society, nor did he harbor any sympathy for his sexual nature. To the emperor, Ludwig Victor was a diseased limb threatening to infect the entire body politic. The punishment was swift, absolute, and devoid of any brotherly mercy. There would be no public trial, like the Harden-Eulenburg affair in Germany, which would only drag the imperial name through the mud. There would be no frantic cover-up involving the flight of the accused, as in the Cleveland Street scandal. Emperor Franz Joseph simply erased his brother from the map of the empire. He issued a direct imperial decree banishing Archduke Ludwig Victor from Vienna. The Archduke was stripped of his military commands, forbidden from attending any court functions, and permanently exiled to Schloss Klesheim, a palace situated in the provincial isolation of Salzburg. He was ordered to remain there for the rest of his natural life, closely monitored by state police, entirely severed from the social oxygen of the capital that had sustained him. The public was given a vague, sanitized explanation regarding the Archduke's declining health, requiring country air. The true nature of his banishment was universally understood, but never officially spoken. The exile at Schloss Klesheim was a gilded tomb. Ludwig Victor spent the next 15 years wandering the massive, empty halls of the Baroque palace. He had avoided the financial extortion that destroyed King Charles, but he paid an infinitely higher price. He paid with his freedom. his identity, and his reality. He was reduced to a ghost, a living cautionary tale about the absolute limits of aristocratic privilege. He was forced to watch from his provincial prison as the world he had known slowly disintegrated. He watched the assassination of his nephew, Archduke Franz Ferdinand. He watched the empire plunge into the abyss of the First World War. He watched the death of his brother, the emperor, and the eventual collapse of the entire Habsburg dynasty in 1918. When Ludwig Victor finally died in 1919, the empire that had exiled him no longer existed. He was buried quietly in a local cemetery, a forgotten relic of a vanished world. The fate of Archduke Ludwig Victor illuminates the final, most brutal mechanism of control employed by the 19th century state against its own. Blackmail, whether executed by a lone American grifter clutching love letters, a ruthless political journalist wielding a magazine, or an outraged military officer throwing a punch, was ultimately just a catalyst. The true destroyer was the state itself. The rigid moral architecture of the era created a zero-sum game. To be a monarch, an archduke, or a lord was to embody an idealized, impossible standard of militaristic masculinity. To deviate from that standard was to become a structural vulnerability. King Charles I of Württemberg, Prince Philip of Eulenburg, Lord Arthur Somerset, and Archduke Ludwig Victor all navigated the exact same treacherous landscape, and all were destroyed by it. Charles tried to buy his way out and died in humiliation. Eulenburg tried to reason his way out and was crushed by the courts. Somerset ran away and died a fugitive. Ludwig Victor stood his ground and was buried alive. Their tragedies were not isolated anomalies. They were the inevitable byproduct of an era that demanded absolute conformity and punished human nature with total annihilation. They were men trapped in the agonizing contradiction of possessing the power to command armies, yet lacking the basic freedom to love without the terrifying, ever-present shadow of the blackmailer, the journalist, and the executioner waiting in the wings. To bring this sprawling, tragic geography of European power back to its origin, we must return to the quiet, suffocating confines of Stuttgart, the grand tour of ruin, from the political slaughterhouse of Berlin to the hypocritical courtrooms of London and the brutal bathhouses of Vienna, reveals a terrifying truth about the 19th century. The destruction of King Charles I of Württemberg was not an anomaly, nor was it merely the result of a foolish old man falling for a charismatic grifter. It was the functioning of a precise lethal system designed to consume anyone who deviated from the rigid blueprint of imperial masculinity. Yet there is a distinct, agonizing uniqueness to the tragedy of Charles I, one that forces us to examine the very nature of love, power, and historical memory. Unlike Lord Arthur Somerset, who fled into exile to escape a prison sentence, or Archduke Ludwig Victor, who was banished by imperial decree, King Charles I was forced to remain exactly where he was. He had to sit on his throne, wear his crown, and look into the eyes of the ministers who knew exactly how much of the national treasury had been liquidated to pay off his American lover. The psychological torture of this existence is difficult to fathom. Charles was a prisoner within his own absolute authority. Following the departure of Charles Woodcock in 1888, the Kingdom of Württemberg did not collapse overnight. Instead, it suffered a slow, corrosive loss of dignity. The king became a ceremonial ghost. Queen Olga, who had endured decades of emotional neglect, stepped into the void, taking on more public duties and charities. quietly absorbing the respect that her husband had squandered. The royal marriage, always a political fiction, froze into a permanent glacial silence. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic Ocean, the architect of this royal humiliation was thriving. Charles Woodcock, the former reader who had arrived in Europe with nothing but his youth and ambition, returned to the United States as a remarkably wealthy man. He did not face justice. He was not pursued by the law. He simply changed his name, integrated himself into the upper middle class society of New York, and eventually married. The profound injustice of this outcome is a bitter pill of history. Woodcock utilized the oppressive, homophobic laws of the German Empire not as a moral crusade, but as a financial instrument. He weaponized the state's hatred to line his own pockets. The man who had written passionate letters declaring his eternal devotion to the king seamlessly transitioned into a calculated extortionist, proving that in the ruthless economy of the Victorian era, the predator was rewarded while the vulnerable were utterly destroyed. The contrast between the two men in their final years perfectly encapsulates the cruelty of the era. The young American who committed the act of extortion lived out his days in comfort and security. The monarch, who committed no crime other than loving another man, was condemned to a life of profound isolation and public mockery. King Charles I died on October 6, 1891. His passing was marked by all the pomp and circumstance required by the state. He was given a grand royal funeral, his casket draped in the flags of the kingdom, followed by processions of military officers and grieving subjects. But the grief was an institutional performance. The man inside the casket had died years earlier. His spirit broke in the moment he watched Woodcock walk away with a fortune in hush money and the very letters that contained his soul. It is those letters, however, that provide the most astonishing twist to this narrative. Woodcock used them as a weapon of blackmail, leveraging their explicit homoerotic content to threaten the king with total annihilation. Yet, because they were preserved, whether by Woodcock as a trophy or through the meticulous archiving of historians who later uncovered the scope of the scandal, these documents underwent a profound transformation. What was once the definitive instrument of a king's destruction has become the very evidence of his humanity. Today, reading the preserved correspondence of King Charles I, one does not see a degenerate criminal or a national security threat. One sees an incredibly lonely man trapped in an impossible position, desperately pouring his heart out to someone he believed cared for him. The letters detail his need for companionship, his deep emotional dependency, and his willingness to risk everything for a moment of genuine connection. In a supreme historical irony, the very words that cost him his dignity during his lifetime are the exact words that redeem his memory today. This redemption, however, comes far too late to offer any comfort to the men who lived through the terror. The systemic eradication of homosexual men from positions of power and influence across Europe left a devastating vacuum. By prioritizing a rigid, aggressive performance of masculinity over diplomacy, empathy, and intellectual nuance, the empires of the 19th century hollowed themselves out. They purged men like Prince Philip of Eulenburg, who actively worked to prevent war, and replaced them with military hardliners who viewed violence as the only legitimate expression of statecraft. The homophobia that drove the blackmail scandals in Stuttgart, Berlin, London, and Vienna was not just a moral failing. It was a catastrophic political miscalculation. It created a culture of paranoia, absolute conformity, and unchecked aggression that led directly to the trenches of the First World War. The monarchies destroyed their most sensitive, artistic, and peaceful minds in the name of moral purity, only to drown their entire continent in blood a few decades later. We are left to observe the sprawling wreckage of these lives, forced to reconcile the immense power these men held with the absolute powerlessness they experienced in the face of their own desires. They possessed the authority to command navies, draft legislation, and alter the borders of nations, yet they could not protect their own bedrooms from the intrusion of the state. They were the masters of the world, held hostage by their own biological reality. The architecture of their ruin, whether it was the calculated greed of a lover, the ruthless ambition of a political rival, or the cold bureaucratic survival instinct of their own families, reveals the ultimate fragility of power when it collides with the terrifying force of human intimacy. As we look back at the grand sweep of this history, a profound and unsettling contradiction emerges, standing like a monument to the cruelty of the age. Consider the image of a man utterly condemned by his contemporaries, stripped of his dignity behind closed doors, blackmailed, mocked as a degenerate, and viewed as a stain upon the moral fabric of his nation. Now place that image directly beside the portrait of a sovereign receiving the highest honors of the state, his chest heavy with medals, his death mourned by tolling bells and firing cannons, buried with the absolute reverence of an empire. Why is this paradox happening? Why does history demand such a schizophrenic performance? The world condemned him for the private truth of his heart, while the state glorified him for the public fiction of his crown. The man beneath the velvet robes was King Charles I of Württemberg, a monarch who possessed everything an empire could offer, but who was ultimately forced to ransom his own soul just to survive the love he was never permitted to have. If the most powerful men in the world could be so easily broken by the simple act of loving another, what does that say about the empires we build and the devastating price of the secrets we are forced to keep?